I'm Peter White. Welcome to the Inside Network. Welcome to the Inside Network. I'm Peter White, and my guest today is John Green. John is the Global Chief Commercial Officer of 91, Global Asset Manager, formerly Investec. John, welcome.
Peter, nice to be here. Thank you for having me today.
Can we talk about the background of 91, your involvement with sustainability and emerging markets? How did that happen? What the trajectory has been?
Yes, indeed. Let me just re-emphasize. We're 32 years old as a firm. For 28 of those 32 years, we were Investec Asset Management, probably well known to your listeners. We demerged from the Investec Group in 2020, nearly 2.5 years ago, and set ourselves up independently as 91. So why are we interested in this question of sustainability? We have roots in an emerging market. We think about the question of sustainability at, if you like, the vanguard of where that question gets considered. We've managed assets and portfolios that have invested in Africa for many years. Many of the sustainability challenges are felt there more, directly than in other parts of the world. And so that experience has really framed how we think about this question.
Your background in South Africa, as you say, you're born out of an emerging market. How does that make you relate directly to sustainability?
So I think a couple of ways. So the first thing is our hometown in South Africa, Cape Town, was one of the first really significant cities that nearly ran out of water in 2018. And that brought this question of climate change really visibly to our world. I think the second thing is, as I mentioned, we invest in Africa a lot. And what we see is that good investing can make a real impact. And so that's framed our approach, which is really centered around real world decarbonization when it comes to climate and real world impact on other areas of sustainability.
What do you think of some people say there's a theme or a trend whereby some investors are reducing exposure to EM because they see it as being a non-sustainable investment or a non-sustainable environment. What's your comment on that situation?
Peter, it's one of our really most significant concerns at the moment in terms of the pursuit of net zero and the role that private sector capital has to play. We know that, and it's correct, that many asset owners and asset managers have set targets. Many of those targets relate to reducing portfolio carbon emissions. The issue that drives is that typically drives capital away from emerging markets, because emerging markets are, on the whole, twice as carbon intensive as developed markets. So if you have to reduce your portfolio carbon, what's the easiest way to do that? Sell emerging markets, buy developed markets. And we see that happening way too much at the moment. And we're very concerned about it. And we're really here to engage with asset owners as to how to think about investing in emerging markets in a way that has real impact.
Well, how can investors help the transition to more sustainability in emerging markets? Is it not logical to sort of shy away from those markets where you think are dirtier or not as clean as their alternatives?
Peter, when we think about net zero, basically the world emits 52 gigatons of GHG emissions every year. Half of that today comes from emerging markets, half. We think that 90%, even 100% arguably, of the growth in emissions, i.e. that 50 gigatons, is going to come from emerging markets in the next 15 years. So if we're not going to think about how to address that problem, if we're not going to try and deploy capital for impact to that problem, then clearly, as private sector capital, you're not going to impact one of the most pressing areas for net zero. And so it's this conflict between a commitment to net zero, but a desire to put capital to work where it will have most impact, which is in emerging markets.
So ironically, it's almost as a commercial responsibility to invest in emerging markets and be activist as an investor. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Now, being activist, I think, is a word that gets interpreted in different ways. We think that the problem is pretty concentrated. So for us, nearly 50 positions in our portfolio of nearly 1,200 companies account for north of 60% of our carbon emissions. If we can successfully engage with those companies, if we can successfully work with them to develop credible transition plans, if we can supply them with the capital that they need to do that successfully, then we can have real world impact. Divesting from emerging markets, leaning away from that problem, doesn't actually address it. And we think that that's a very possible scenario.
Well, you're saying if we can, have you done it? And can you give us some examples of success?
So, one of the biggest cement companies in the world is an emerging market-based cement company. They successfully, nearly 2 months ago, trialed a process of generating solar generated clinker. Now, that will reduce the emissions of the cement production process by nearly 50%, and that is enormous. The impact that has on construction, on growth, and on the general economies of emerging markets around the world is enormous. That company is going to need capital to industrialize that process. They're going to come to investors like us. They're going to come to other investors who potentially will deploy capital to emerging markets. And so there is a fantastic opportunity to have real world impact. And also ultimately to generate return for your stakeholders.
And what was the influence of investors and potential investors in that decision to move to a more sustainable operation in terms of the cement manufacturer?
So the interesting thing, Peter, is that many of these large companies in emerging markets who are carbon intense have significant capital needs. Those are equity capital needs, but also debt capital needs. We've seen that particularly in the debt capital markets, there's really a much more significant opportunity to have impact.
That's fascinating. Debt more than equity?
Yes, because debt rolls over more quickly. The need to refinance is something that gets signaled well ahead of time. Lining up replacement finance is a very important process. And in that process, what you can do is really engage with how are you going to use these funds? What is your transition plan? How are these funds going to get applied to that transition plan? And it's in that process that international investors have a meaningful impact. And that's why actually we see the fact that emerging market companies are moving much faster in thinking about the transition than their countries. And interestingly, many of them are held hostage to an extent by the energy systems that they operate in. And some of them are even breaking out of that. We're seeing in my home country now the ability for companies to generate their own power up to 100 megawatts. And that's a significant policy shift advocated by investors. And that's releasing a whole lot of opportunity for companies to invest in a cleaner energy system and in a much more significant decarbonized product generation. So we're very optimistic about the bottom-up effects, and we're concerned that the way in which many asset owners are setting their targets is meaning that capital gets withdrawn from emerging markets.
What are some of the key themes that you see being discussed amongst asset owners around the world and institutional investors?
So I think this theme, Peter, around how do we balance the need to clean our portfolios in terms of carbon versus ensuring that at the same time we have an impact in the real world is becoming really a theme that many asset owners are focusing on. And how to set measures that align with that desire. So I can say pretty categorically, most of the asset owners we talk to, most of the investment managers we talk to, are clear about the need to make an impact in the real world versus just in the portfolio. The problem is that
how?
Is how and how to set measures to reinforce that. And I think that we're spending a lot of time thinking with our asset owner clients about how to do that effectively. One of the things that we are certainly positive about is to define a transition portfolio separately from your mainstream portfolio. That allows you to think about the carbon dynamics of your transition portfolio and its targets very differently. So that's the first thing that we do. The second thing that we do is we certainly as a firm have committed to, certainly in the short term, a percentage of our portfolio financed emissions having verified transition plans as our principal target. So that's not a short-term portfolio carbon target. It's a short-term target for the companies we hold to have a verified transition target. And we focus in on the most carbon-intensive companies that we hold to do that. So when you crystallize this problem down, you get it down into a few companies that have significant emissions that need to develop transition plans, and that's where we focus our effort. And that's how we try and help asset owners think about this problem.
This concept of a transition portfolio, what sort of reception is that getting?
I think
there's
there's a lot more discussion happening on it. I think that asset owners want to be as sure as they can be that transition is not just dressed up as continuing to emit. And I think that that's where investment managers like ourselves need to step up to the plate, and we need to have transition plan assessment methodologies. We need to be able to assess capital expenditure and how that's being applied to the transition. We need to assess real actions versus words in companies. And that's where, active, judgment-centered investing is coming back, I think, to play a really important role in this transition.
In terms of geographies, are there any areas of the world that you see more advanced and more opportunistic for investors looking to do what you're talking about?
So interestingly, we see that companies who have embraced the need to transition, particularly in emerging markets, are pretty well spread. You have certain emerging market economies that have very low carbon intensive energy systems and are very lucky as a consequence. Brazil is one of those. So their companies are far less carbon intensive because of the way they generate their energy. Companies that are operating in carbon intensive economies need to be far more innovative, need capital far more. South Africa is one of them. South Africa is the most carbon-intensive energy system in the world in terms of carbon emitted per kilowatt hour. And so there, the companies are being innovative in terms of how they generate their own electricity. So we're seeing companies really adapting to their environments, and we think capital needs to adapt with that. And our biggest concern at the moment is that capital is struggling to do that.
Well, John, that's a relatively optimistic note to finish on. Thank you for your time today.
Peter, thank you for having me.